Hello, my name's Timaeus, and this is the second in a series of videos I've entitled Walking the Platonic Path, exploring the philosophy of the Platonic tradition. And this one is given a subtitle, Know Thyself. This is the first of three, which I hope will give an overview of the Platonic tradition and its path, and then I will move on after that to look at particular aspects of the philosophy in more detail. So, there are a number of questions which profoundly shape each human life. What am I? What is my origin? What kind of life is a good life for me? What kind of world am I living in? What's my relationship with that world? And what's my relationship with my origin? Perhaps all of those questions are, in a way, compressed into the very first line of Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, where Socrates opens it by saying, "Where have you come from, O Phaedrus, and where are you going?" As I say, those questions do shape every life. Some people ask those questions with clarity, with consciousness, and others less so. But the answer to all of those questions really comes out in the life we lead. And philosophy, if you like, from that point of view, is a way of helping us make that answer truthful. When we look at a human being, the most striking aspect of each individual is how much of their life is directed by personal choices. We, of course, have instincts, as all earthly creatures have. But whereas most creatures are pretty much a slave to their instinct, the human being does have the power to override any particular instinct, even the most powerful, if there is sufficient reason. In fact, if you look at the human life just on through the period of one day, I'm pretty certain you wouldn't be able to count the number of choices that human being makes. The difference between a life lived from wise choices and a life lived from foolish choices is huge. And I don't think anybody would, if you offered them a magic wand and said, from now on all your choices can be wise or all your choices can be foolish, which do you want? I don't believe that anyone would say, give me the foolish choices. From that point of view, every human being is a philosopher. We have no choice, if you like. We are philosophers. What we have before us is the option of being a careful and good philosopher or a careless and more or less bad philosopher. As I say, those questions are for everyone to answer. And the Platonic tradition addresses all of humankind. So let me read what Socrates says in the Republic, pretty much right at the end, after 10 books of exploring human life. This is what Socrates says. This, of all things, is most to be studied. In what manner every one of us, omitting other disciplines, shall become an inquirer and learner in this study, if by any means he be able to learn and find out who will give him the ability and wisdom to discern a good life and a bad, and to choose everywhere and at all times the best of what is possible, considering all things now mentioned, having an eye to the nature of the soul, to comprehend both the worse and the better life, pronouncing that to be the worse, which shall lead the soul to become more unjust, and that to be the better life, which shall lead it to become more just, and to dismiss every other consideration. So, we can see from this summary position towards which the Republic works that the criteria of choices we make is goodness. We must lead the best life, says Socrates. Choose everywhere that which is good and avoid its opposite. And in fact, if you think about what we're doing when we make our choices, we are calculating, although quite often with not very much thought, whether the result from option A will bring more goodness than the result of option B. Or sometimes we calculate whether a particular choice will avoid more evil, if you like. So all choices refer to goodness in some way, and we'll come back to look at that more carefully in a moment. But of course, when we make that calculation, we are making the calculation that the goodness is my appropriate goodness. It's quite clear that what we are changes what goodness should be aimed at. It would be useless for us to pursue a life that would be good for a hamster, for example, or a tree. So the Platonic quest really begins with that very first question: what am I? Socrates quotes the exhortation which, according to reports, was placed at the entrance of the Delphic sanctuary where the ancient Greeks would go to ask questions when they were faced with choices, and that notice said, "Know thyself." Socrates quotes that in several dialogues: the Protagoras, the Phaedrus, the Charmides, the first Alcibiades, the Hipparchus. And in fact, he says that other questions must take second place. It's no good pursuing all kinds of knowledge without having first established a satisfactory answer to the question, what am I? So let me give you an example. In the Phaedrus, when Socrates is questioned about the interpretation of a mythical event, this is what he says: "I have not leisure for such an undertaking, and this because I am not yet able, according to the Delphic precept, to know myself. But it appears to me to be ridiculous, while I am yet ignorant of this, to speculate things foreign from the knowledge of myself. Hence, bidding farewell to these, and being persuaded in the opinion which I have just now mentioned respecting them, I do not contemplate these, but myself, considering whether I am not a wild beast possessing more foals than Typhon, and far more raging and fierce, or whether I am a more mild and simple animal, naturally participating of a certain divine and modest condition. It's obvious, I think, that all the answers to the other questions turn upon our being able to, at least in outline, answer that first question: what am I? What a good life should be, what our goals should be, what our relationship to the world and to our origin should be, all depends on what we are. And even our understanding of the world around us requires us to understand what kind of creature is inspecting that world, what position we take, the angle that we're looking at. I think somewhere Plato says that it's obvious that if a man stands on his head, what's on his left looks to be on his right, and what's on his right looks to be on the left. So we do have to understand what we are before we can make intelligent inquiry into the nature of the world that surrounds us. The Platonic schools of late antiquity had a particular syllabus, a particular order of Platonic dialogues, which they offered to their students. And the first dialogue was the first Alcibiades. It's a conversation between Socrates and a young nobleman, Alcibiades, a Athenian nobleman, who comes from a good family, who's considering taking up politics, and Socrates stops him before he jumps into the political field and shows him that philosophy is needed before and during one's political career. Once he's proved to Alcibiades that he needs philosophy, the Delphic exhortation, "Know thyself," takes centre stage. And we're fortunate to have a commentary from Proclus on that dialogue, and this is what he says pretty much right at the beginning of that commentary. The most valid and surest starting point for the dialogues of Plato, and practically for the whole of philosophical study, is, in our opinion, the discerning of our own being. If this is correctly posited, we shall in every way, I think, be able more accurately to understand both the good that is appropriate to us and the evil that fights against it. For, as the essence of things are different, so are the proper perfections. And a little later he says, "Nothing is nearer to us than ourselves." If then we do not perceive what is nearest, what means is there of ascertaining the more remote, and what is naturally perceived through our agency? This is the first conversation that Socrates initiates with Alcibiades, and that it is he himself who says that the beginnings of perfection depend upon the consideration of ourselves. So let's follow the Alcibiades in its exploration of selfhood. Once Socrates has brought the Delphic exhortation into the conversation, he quite quickly offers to Alcibiades two candidates for what constitutes the self. It's either the soul or the body. Now, the modern reader may be surprised how easily and without objection Alcibiades accepts the notion of soul, but we do need to remember that this is a simpler conception of soul than we have nowadays. Over the last 2,500 years, many ideas have attached themselves, if you like, to the idea of soul, and especially now the modern thinker worries that the soul is a religious idea, and if they admit the existence of the soul, then a host of other religious ideas, God, immortality, divine judgment, heaven and hell, will slip into the party, so to speak, uninvited. So we do need to put ourselves back and say, this conception of soul that's being discussed in the first Alcibiades is relatively simple. The soul is the life-giving, life-bearing thing, invisible, that arrives and gives matter animation. It's something that allows a thinking life to be led. It's something that allows decisions to be made, choices to be made. And it's, if you like, Socrates points out that there's a difference between the soul as user and the body as instrument. So, as we know, it's the thinking something that tells the body to pick up a pen or a sword or a violin. It's the thinking something, which we're calling soul, which decides how those instruments will be used and when they'll be put down. The body hears sounds, words, but it's the inner self which interprets those words as something meaningful and, if necessary, tells the body to form words with lips and tongue in order to respond. It's the arrival of the soul in matter which gives life, and it may be worth just remembering that the Greek word for soul, psyche, is also the word for breath, and we measure the life from the first breath to the last breath. Without the soul, the body could not move. Without the soul, the body would have no desire to move towards something or away from something. So from outside it looks like the body is self-motive, but our own observation of our inner state makes us understand that in fact it's the soul that's self-motive and the body is merely responding to directions from that thinking something. We can have a concept of a musician. The musician is still a musician when her lyre is broken. Or concept of a shoemaker. The shoemaker is still a shoemaker when her knife is blunted. This is the relationship that Socrates offers to Alcibiades. He then goes through a conversation in order to decide which of these two should be considered the self. And this is how the conversation goes. Further, I suppose, that no man would ever think otherwise than this.
Than what?
That a man himself was one of these three things.
What three things?
Soul, or body, or a compound of them both, constituting one whole.
What besides could be imagined?
Now we agreed that the being which governs the body is the man.
We did.
What being then is the man? Does the body itself govern itself?
By no means.
For the body, we said, was governed.
True.
The body then cannot be that being which we are in search of.
It seems not.
But whether does the compound being govern the body, and whether is this the man?
Perhaps it is.
Least of any of the three can this be so, for of two parties, one of which is the party governed, there is no possibility that both of them should govern jointly.
Right.
Since then neither the body nor the compound of soul and body together is the man, it remains, I think, either that a man's self is nothing at all, or if it be anything, it must be concluded that the man is no other than the soul. So that agreement between Socrates and Alcibiades is a very small step, but an essential one, and one that opens the way for much more exploration of the nature of the self, the nature of the soul. Alcibiades, being philosophically naive, believes they've dealt with the matter. Socrates himself says, no, we've just discovered what the self is based on, so to speak. The nature of the self itself has yet to be investigated. But just to make sure that Alcibiades understands what's been decided, Socrates says this. This, therefore, was our meaning when we said a little before that Socrates discoursed with Alcibiades, making use of reason. We meant, it seems, that he directed his words and arguments not to your outward person, but to Alcibiades himself, that is, to the soul. He therefore enjoins a person to recognize the soul, he who gives him this injunction, to know himself. So the implications of this position taken, that the soul is the user, the body is the instrument, are profound. It's above all else, if we accept that the musician is a musician even when her lyre is broken, the shoemaker is still a shoemaker even when her knife is blunted, we will have to consider the viability of the soul even when its instrument, the body, is broken by death. Plato, of course, will take a number of dialogues to explore some of the more important implications of this. But we begin to see the nature of the soul even here, and even in this most elementary examination. You will notice that in the quote we've just quoted, Socrates uses the word reason, logos, and its cognates twice. This seems to be the starting point for our examination of what the nature of the soul itself is. Certainly the answers we give to those questions which I listed at the beginning are radically different if we accept that the soul is the self. The relationship we have with the world, the cosmos, the relationship we have with our origin, the kind of life, the kind of goals we should be setting ourselves, all of these are radically different if we are simply the soul. So just to be clear, what we have taken from this first elementary examination are two really important fundamental truths. One, that the self of the human being is the soul, and secondly, that the relation of soul to body is user to instrument. As we begin to know ourselves in these terms, as Proclus said, the good that's appropriate to us, the perfection that's appropriate to us, becomes clearer. And insofar as we ourselves direct our perfection, our actions can become more efficient. If you like, the primary question about our goodness must always be referred to the soul. Plato's ideal philosopher, that is to say, Socrates, is faced with a choice in his trial. Either he must abandon his philosophical quest, which he considers to be divinely ordained, divinely inspired, or he can continue it but must drink the hemlock. The question then is his goodness the ruination of his body but the betterment of his soul, or the ruination of his soul but the preservation of his body? He, of course, chooses to drink the hemlock but continue his philosophical quest. And it culminates in the dialogue called the Phaedo, in which some of the most important elements of Platonic psychology are unfolded, and at the same time, or right at the end, Socrates drinks his hemlock. So, to summarise, that is our position. We are all living a life. The question is that life going to better the soul or not? That's what arises from this user-instrument relationship. In the next video, we will look at the path that the human being as a soul can take through this life and possibly subsequent lives.